Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. I just have a quick announcement. Let's see, I posted on into the module for this week, and I'll put in an announcement as well, a review aid, which is the figures taken from Garrison, which might be helpful in studying. These figures cover key concepts in oceanography from the text. And it's possible that some of these figures will be included in the exam and you'll be asked to comment on them or interpret them for part of the exam question. So that's in the module for this week. Let's see if I can find that. Yeah, so here they are. These are the review figures. And so these are concepts, these are all things that you will have seen before, but they're presented here just to help you to have some ideas of the sort of major concepts that are out there. So this is you can find these figures in the module for this last week, 20 to 26 April. Okay, so now we'll get started, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Beach Please should please share their screen, and we will get going on that.
Okay, can you see the presentation?
Yes, I can.
All right, cool.
All right. We are Beach Please, and our topic is hydrothermal vents and the origin of life with Raquel Polera, Alex Pilcher, Taylor Barton, Brendan Johnson, Josh Schwartz, and Karina Papadianis. And here we go.
Next slide. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, ever since the discovery of hydrothermal vents back in 1977, this has opened the door to many new discoveries of new organisms as well as new theories just based off of all the different attributes that are come along with that environment down by the hydrothermal vents. These new ecosystems discovered are filled with all different types of nutrients and other organic material, which allow for a new and wide variety of biodiversity. But it does bring up many questions of how are these organisms able to survive at such a unique environment, in such a harsh environment. Next slide. And here's just an outline. Well, that was our outline of all the material we'll be going over today, as well as everybody's contributions within the group. But one discovery was the submarine chimneys. These form along the boundary border where these hydrothermal vents are distributing different material out from the vents. And after a while, this collection of some of the material that it comes out of the vents, as you guys can see on the right-hand side in that image, they collect near the base of it. And over time, once it cools down, it creates this chimney, as you guys can see from there. And there's two different types. There's a black smoke vent as well as the white smoke vent. The black smoke is much hotter and contains higher levels of metal and acid concentration, whereas the white is slightly cooler, but it does contain higher levels of methane and alkali concentrations. And this is just one of the many discoveries made.
Hydrothermal vents are important due to their potential for new discovery. In being relatively new to science and unresearched, almost everything discovered challenges our understanding of modern biology. In observing relationships between symbiotic organisms at these vents, we gain insight into biodiversity particularly. Symbiosis between tube worms and invertebrates near hydrothermal vents provides dissolved nitrogen and nutrients to the microhabitat near the vents. However, nitrogen levels within the organisms are extremely low compared to other deep sea organisms. This suggests that there may be very high levels of inorganic nitrogen surrounding the vent due to this symbiotic relationship supporting the vent's habitat. Understanding these vents also supports our knowledge of understood scientific principles like ocean stratification by salinity and density. Technological developments have also advanced as our studies of hydrothermal vents have progressed, including developments in the measurement of oxygen levels by zooplankton and how that is affected by local water pressure at the depths of the vents. Next slide, please.
All right, well, the importance of research on hydrothermal vents with chemosynthesis. Compared to the heterotrophic hypothesis on the origin of life, hydrothermal vent systems become as more intuitive. In this quote right here, it says the vent theory suggests that the earliest life was chemosynthetic, and chemosynthesis is, well, synthesis in general is creating more complex compounds out of simpler materials to create organic compounds out of it through bacteria or other organisms. And with this hydrothermal zone, there's basically magma spewing out, so there's not as much normal stuff that organisms on the land surface use. So they had to create some sort of way to continue life in the deep sea with no sunlight. In other words, the earliest organisms took biochemical advantage of the imbalance of chemical reactions in the mixing zones of hydrothermal systems. In that picture right there is a hydrothermal vent. Next slide. Yeah, like I said before, chemosynthesis is creating organic compounds by bacteria or other organisms out of inorganic materials, and these reactions take place with minimal sunlight. On the land, plants and animals can thrive off of photosynthesis because there's sunlight, which activates everything and creates the life, but down in the deep sea, there's no sunlight, and that's where the vents come in and supply these materials. The reason why there's a large amount of biomass within the hydrothermal vent is due to the processes that occur at this depth, using mainly oxygen to oxidize hydrogen sulfide and producing large amounts of organic carbon. Anaerobic processes can also occur, but they don't nearly provide the same amount of energy input, meaning it cannot sustain a large portion of life down there. And right here's a formula. Basically CO2, carbon dioxide, and water, dihydrogen sulfide, and oxygen produces formaldehyde and sulfuric acid, which is a general process used for life down there. And in the picture, you can kind of see how that works out. All right, next slide.
Yeah, because of all of this allows for new organisms that are very unique and can adapt to such a unique environment. One example would be these microorganisms called hypothermophiles, which are microorganisms that are just very unique for their ability to survive in such a harsh environment. The temperatures can range, but do reach up to 90 degrees Celsius and above, which is crazy to think about an organism can even survive at that level. But they're so unique to that ability to adapt to such a harsh environment. It just allows for many scientists to open up the door and ask questions of how are these organisms able to survive at such an extreme length, and what adaptive properties within their genetics themselves allow them to do this. And this specific adaptation for the species also helps to support that life may first have evolved when Earth was much hotter than it is now. And that's why studying these organisms, it's just one of many that are down there, provide a unique way of how they survive. Next slide, please. Oh, there we go.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. Okay, so this slide's based on how biodiversity and species richness has developed based off the geophysical processes. Some examples include the shifting of plate tectonics, volcanism, and ocean currents, creating these hydrothermal vents. volcanism plays into it because the vent communities can be paved over a seafloor lava, or killing all life, or they also may disperse the animal larvae. The vents are also unique to other natural systems because they can withhold extreme temperatures. And then biologists are able to study how life can survive at these temperatures and at these chemical conditions, specifically the biochemical properties of the bacteria. And it brings questions on why vents have low but unique diversity with high abundance of these species, but depending on each vent location. And on this side right here is just an example of different species that can be found at these vents. And the picture at the bottom is specifically of the tube worms, which is a very popular one. One second, I'm trying to. Okay, so then now the question is endosymbiosis. And it basically, to sum it up, it's one organism living inside another. And it's a symbiotic relationship, so each are benefiting from it. Tube worms are the vital host of endosymbiosis in hydrothermal vents because they carry these microorganisms that have different biochemical abilities that permit them to withstand the harsh environments of these vents. This relationship can be harmful to tube worms because the high levels of hydrogen sulfide at these vents is toxic to most organisms until it is able to be oxidized within the hemoglobin of their red blood cells. However, their anatomy is well suited for this, and the bacteria provides nutrients while also taking care of the toxic sulfides that find its way inside the tube worm, which shows again how the relationship can be mutually beneficial. A side note I wanted to add was that the symbiosis of bacteria also has been used as research to determine carbon metabolism, and human activity also has been researched in its effects of hydrothermal vents and how it can change them.
The amount of nitrogen cycled in and around these vents derives curiosity in research at these vents because the distribution in organisms is strange. Organisms in and closer to the vents seem to have lower levels of nitrogen rather than those farther from the vents. We know where we have come to understand this is due to the transfer of nitrogen into inorganic chemicals such as a result of symbiotic relationships and the chemosynthesis that is going on. This releases nitrogen as a byproduct within the chemicals of the vents rather than the more normal water farther away from the vents. As discussed before, the synthesis of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, and hydrogen, among other elements, came from the necessity of evolutionarily deriving new energy producing processes. Such processes continue to be researched to give insight or link to the use of extreme conditions found at these vents and compare them to early conditions on Earth and how the origin of life may have used these processes or ones similar to the ones observed at the hydrothermal vents, or the modern vents. Next slide.
So the fauna in these hydrothermal vent ecosystems, fauna is another way of saying animal life of a given region. The animals found at these communities are fast growing and good at dispersing to new sites and have high levels of reproduction. These vents though create harsh environments of high temperature, low oxygen, and various compounds, including hydrogen sulfide, methane, and other heavy metals, which make it hard for animals to survive in. The chemosynthetic organisms make up the primary production of these regions, which gain nutrients from the hydrogen sulfide and other compounds. There's specific or specialized taxa, including the alvinellid polychite family. One of the examples is to the right here, called the Pompeii worm, but also known as the nipple-eyed demon worm, because as you can see in this picture, it kind of looks like that. But this is a specific species found there. And then other ones found at different hydrothermal vents are eel pout, which is this, and they're considered very rare. And then tube worms, as seen before, crabs and clam, just depending though on the different water depth, temperature, chemistry, and currents.
Okay, so the tube worm that we're specifically talking about is called the vestimentiferan tube worm. And we showed a picture of it a few slides back. It's white bottom, and then it has like a red top, which is called the red plume. And so this specific organism has no mouth, no digestive system, and then no anus. So the way it actually lives is through that red plume, where it absorbs the hydrogen sulfide and then it converts it into a usable energy form that not only it can use to survive, but it can also produce a trophozomic tissue around its outside, and that's made of a chemosynthetic bacteria, which actually a lot of other organisms use, because in these deep high temperature climates, there's tons of fauna that need to survive. However, some of them don't necessarily have the capabilities to adapt to the climate that they're in, or the environment that they're in. So what they do is they work together with these different kinds of organisms that can convert the chemicals into a usable energy. So there's a type of crab called the brachyuran crab, and what it does is it kind of just posts up near like tube worms territory, and then whenever like the tube worms, I guess, kind of throw off some of the bacteria, it'll actually collect on the shell of the crab, and it has it has a special claw where it can scrape it up and then consume the bacteria off of itself, which I thought was kind of a cool thing. And then there's two other ones. There's some mussels and clams, which we do have in other places of the ocean, but unlike the other mussels, the vent mussels have fully filter feeding. So similar to like a big whale, where it can kind of just swallow and then digest things, the mussels are able to also digest some sorts of food for themselves. Whereas the clams are similar to the tube worms, where they don't have a mouth, but they do have ways to absorb hydrogen sulfide and then convert it into a usable energy for their feet, for their from their foot. Sorry. Can you get next slide? All right. So talking about these chemosynthetic bacteria again, they're probably one of the most important things around the vent faunas, just because a lot of organisms rely on it. And so, like I said before, they inhabit tube worms. They convert hydrogen sulfide, which is normally toxic to many organisms. They turn it into a less toxic form of energy, where they can either eat the bacteria, or in this case, it's called the symbiotic bacteria. And what it does is it's kind of like a redoxing reaction, like we learned in chemistry. So the chemical reductants from like the chemical reaction will like transfer an electron and allow it to like store energy in that way. And so what it does is it allows it to support autotrophy for other organisms to consume later. And it's a vital relationship, not only for the organisms, but like the functions as well. There's also a different kind of bacteria called free living, where they just kind of float around, and then organisms such as barnacles and other kinds of moving around organisms are able to eat them. So there's kind of like they're just kind of chilling, allowing other people to survive. And so the bacteria use fluctuating exposure in the vent fluid to efficiently store their energy. And so the minimal consumption practice ensures survival in times where like there's fluctuation in the amount of nutrients being dispersed. So it's probably one of the most efficient ways to do it in an intermittency kind of energy fluctuation.
Okay, so this is a diagram of the various organisms which live in hydrothermal vent ecosystems. So you can see how the majority is taken up by tube worms, since these are really prevalent in this ecosystem. but there are many different organisms which use these tube worms for food and for shelter, such as scale worms, sea spiders, and snails. Another important thing to notice here is the bacterial filaments, which are on the tube worms. As explained in the previous slides, these bacteria play a crucial role in providing nutrients for tube worms, as well as other organisms that depend on tube worms. Next slide, please. So other topics to understand hydrothermal vents. One major topic in understanding this ecosystem is to understand the geological processes that occur here, because without these processes, life could not exist in this environment. The high heat with no light energy for photosynthesis makes it especially difficult for life to exist. So the organisms that do live here go through unique processes for obtaining nutrients. Also, much of this life could not be supported without symbiotic relationships. Almost all the organisms living in these habitats rely on at least one other organism for survival. So how could research improve on these deep ocean environments? First of all, advances in technology. With advances, we could create something that could research these deep sea areas for longer periods of time and more accurately, and could help with new discoveries. Another thing that could help improve research is funding. Without funding, you cannot have research, and not enough can be made. The more we research these areas of the ocean floor, the more we can understand how they connect with other parts of the ocean and their importance in the ocean. Next slide.
Okay, okay, good. You're wrapping up. Great. Go ahead.
Okay, so see, these are some of the sources we use. A lot of them are newer, just because some of the newer technology was necessary to see the events and how the faunas react in their environments. A lot of them were taken off of like JSTOR and a lot of the school system databases that we used. I mean, yeah, there's a lot to go over here, but for the most part, they all kind of talk about the organisms that are living there, and then the different kinds of vents, and then what they produce and what they push out for the organisms to use, and then how the organisms interact with each other. And that's Beach Please, and that's hydrothermal vents.
Okay, very good. Any quick questions from the class? So I guess I have some questions. You didn't really discuss where in the world you can find hydrothermal vent communities.
I was looking earlier, and I think it said near like mid-ocean ridges where it's very deep, I would say. Possibly where there's some sort of divergent boundaries. Maybe that's where volcanism tends to protrude from the ground, I would imagine.
Yeah,
Okay.
I saw some research about them being on the back arc basins and near the poles.
Yep.
Anywhere warmer geologic activity below the surface of the oceans tends to spring some sort of vent up. That's where you get the white vent comes less from divergent boundaries and more so just random geologic thermal events coming from the bottom.
Okay, well, you're talking about the difference between white smokers and black smokers, and then the vents like Lost City of the Atlantis vents, which are, spectacular vents, but they're very different chemistry. So yeah, okay, a lot of questions here. So I guess one question is, where does the energy come from? So we know that all ecosystems depend on energy. And could you be a little more specific about where the energy that supports the hydrothermal vent ecosystems? What is the source of that energy?
Well, there's between the extreme heat that is also converted in their energy converting processes, as well as the more or less trace amounts of metals and carbons and whatnot that are transferred in these processes. Because there's several chemical processes taken in respirating energy between the different types of bacteria and other chemosynthetic organisms. But these organisms, they don't go very far, and they don't do very much, so they don't require much energy. So the energy that is transferred through their say transfer of hydrogen sulfide and whatnot isn't a large amount, but it's enough to satisfy bacterial populations and stuff that facilitate the other symbiotic organisms like tube worms and such.
You're not saying that the heat energy is actually used to fix new carbon, are you?
No, but it's involved in the process because it has to survive the amount of heat in order to transfer the nitrogen and the carbon into organic energy.
Okay,
Organic
what I'm looking for is the chemical energy that's released when reduced compounds like H2S or even hydrogen are oxidized, right? So that when you oxidize something, there's a energy, it releases the energy, in that chemical reaction, right? You understand that?
Yes.
Okay, so that if you oxidize hydrogen sulfide, you're getting there's a change in the Gibbs free energy, which is available to the organisms, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that the energy that drives hydrothermal vent ecosystems comes from this chemical potential, this oxidation potential of reduced compounds. And the reduced compounds are principally sulfides, polymetallic sulfides, that are extruded with the vent fluids. And so that's the critical thing here. And so I think that's a concept that needs to be explained. And so do you have an idea of why chemosynthesis or chemoautotrophy might have been the origin of life? I mean, why would that have occurred? What evidence is there for that?
Well, with such low oxygen levels at a particular time, but as well as replicated in these vents, so hot and extreme in that they don't necessarily have high oxygen, but have higher hydrogen sulfide and nitrogen and such. The only things around were these chemicals, so there had to be some sort of way to turn these chemicals into a transfer of energy through the Gibbs free energy cycle and such.
Yeah, if I'm remembering correctly, the chemosynthesis, it talks a lot about how there's an imbalance in these reactions, and because there are these microorganisms and these, I guess they're considered autotrophs, or they kind of fit themselves into these reactions to create I don't know exactly the best way to phrase it, but yeah, I just remember a lot about how in the origin of these, like when they were studying how these hydrothermal vents were creating life, there was a lot of emphasis how these bacteria and other organisms didn't really require a lot, but were able to kind of place themselves into these reactions to create these communities.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll have to leave it there and we'll go on to the next talk. So you can stop sharing your screen, please, and go ahead and so the next up will be the emotions. And so whoever is presenting should please go ahead, and everybody else should mute, but the presenters for emotions should unmute. And I guess it's Raquel. Are you presenting the slides?
I just did that for Beach.
Okay. All right. Go ahead and upload your slides, please. Upload, but present. Share your screen.
Okay, can you see the screen?
Yes, I see it fine. I think everybody can see it.
Awesome. Okay, so we are the emotions, and our topic is the overfishing of coral reefs and the impacts that it has on biodiversity and human populations. So our introduction, coral reefs around the world have been in decline for decades, with a multitude of factors negatively affecting them. One of the least talked about and most detrimental causes is overfishing. Overfishing occurs when a number of organisms in an area are manually reduced faster than it can naturally repopulate. This results in lowered populations of various organisms, lower catches for the fishing industry, and potentially the collapse of an entire ecosystem or multiple. So today, this is the outline of who's going to be talking and about what. So firstly, Callie is going to talk about the history of the topic and the impacts for biodiversity, human society, and culture. Next, I will address the local and regional relevance and the Earth system implications. Bunny will continue with the scientific principles we cover and how they relate to what we studied in class and the scientific consensus. Tanya will address the impacts of climate change and economic factors. And finally, Cole will talk about the materials and methods.
Hi there. So I'm Callie, and I focused on the history of overfishing in the coral reefs. I pulled from an article called Ecological and Socioeconomic Strategies to Sustain Caribbean Coral Reefs in a High CO2 World. It focuses specifically on Caribbean sea corals as they are somewhat unique due to its isolation from other tropical seas. As it has a low taxonomy diversity and minimal ecological redundancy, yet these reefs have been able to persist for more than 3 million years. The introduction of fishing herbivorous fish, as well as the mass mortality rate of sea urchins, allowed for fleshy algae to dominate to the detriment of these coral reefs. This, combined with the decline of reef builders that provided structural integrity to the reef framework, only compacted the issue. Since the 70s, reefs have seen a decrease in population by over 60%, which is pretty astounding. Could you go to the next slide, please, Alex? And so this decline has had some disastrous impacts on the human communities that relied on the reefs for their nutritional resources, economic benefits, and physical protections from disaster events such as storms. As more people relied on unsustainable fishing practices such as trawling or cyanide fishing, the corals were less likely to bounce back. Once the reef's population size begins to dwindle, the economic benefits that the reefs provided also declined. If you want to see it closer to home, Southeast Florida alone rakes in around $174 million from recreational activities associated with the corals, and the US in total gets around $3.4 billion a year, which is a huge portion of our revenue. This shows a connection between the health of the coral reefs and the overall economic health of the communities that rely on them. And the next slide.
Okay, so I will be talking about the regional relevance of this issue. So as you can see by this map here, it shows the coral reefs that are present around the area. And as you can see, it's mostly concentrated around the Caribbean Sea. And there are not many reefs present in the Gulf of Mexico. And this is due to the increased temperature when compared to the overall Atlantic Ocean. And that's why you don't see many reefs there. According to I pulled from an article from Tim McClanahan called The Ecological States and the Resilience of Coral Reefs. And he says that in his article, he mentions that reefs under 30 degrees of latitude are subject to many changes in their environment from both humans and naturally. And so this then goes into the Earth system implications, because this is happening all around the world and not just near us. So this chart shows how coral reefs are affected by different things. So in the middle, it says fish, coral, and coralline algae dominance, and that's the natural state. But as you can see, through pollution and fishing, there are many different ways that you can alter the natural state of it. So, for example, through pollution and fishing, you can end up with turf algal dominance, or algae heterotrophs and bioeroders. And the only way to bring it back to the natural state is to reduce fishing to a sustainable amount.
So I'm Bunny, and I will be talking about the topics we covered in class and how it relates to the coral reefs, and then the scientific community consensus. To start with, we had a few lectures on overfishing itself, and fishing methods in various fisheries. And one thing people might not realize is that the corals, fish not only depend on the corals, but corals also depend on the fish. Fish like parrotfish come in and clear out space for more corals to grow by eating corals that are already there. Some tangs farm the algae off of corals to keep them clean so they can access their sunlight. So when a major player in this ecosystem is removed through fishing, or because their prey is removed through fishing, or their population explodes because their predator was removed through overfishing, this has an extreme domino effect on the entire reef. And in addition to that, some of the ways that people are fishing in general, specifically bottom trawling, is extremely harmful to the reefs. These trawlers will come through, and by being weighted on the bottom, they drag through and just destroy all of this coral in their wake, and the people fishing don't really care. So all of these corals are just dead and gone in a few hours. And the scientific community has made it very clear that our coral reefs are dying at an extreme rate, for various reasons like climate change, but also overfishing and pollution, and they need to be reined in, or else all these corals will be gone in 70 years. In addition to overfishing, nutrient pollution is being shown to harm corals on a microbiological level. They are kind of being poisoned by these plastic micropellets and extreme nitrogen overload, so that when these tiny changes in temperature and pH come, they're already weakened, kind of like your immune system is weakened. Sorry, that's my dog. Jasper, shush. So these small changes that they might be able to survive anyway, now they can't, and they die off at an even faster rate. Next slide.
Hi, I'm Tanya, and now we're going to discuss the effects of climate change on coral reefs and how reef overfishing, it not only compounds that devastation, but it also significantly contributes to the economic collapse of its own industry. So to get an overview, here's a map of all the major coral reef regions in the world. Starting in the far right, our neck of the woods, you see highlighted in blue the coral regions of the Atlantic Ocean. We also see reef regions of the Indian Ocean, Middle East, Southeast Asian, and regions in the Pacific. And below the Pacific, highlighted in pink, are reefs surrounding Australia. And there's some especially noteworthy facts about Australia's reefs. It's the world's largest coral reef system, meaning its coral area is not as expansive as that of the Pacific, but it's the world's largest single structure made of living organisms, and it can actually be seen from outer space. So another remarkable aspect of Australia is located on its northeastern portion off the coast of Queensland. It's a marine protected area that we've all heard of, called the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, which is a very well managed protected area, but it's not just for conservation. The great thing is that there are designated areas used for commercial and recreational fishing, research, indigenous traditional use, shipping, and commercial and marine tourism. And their model of marine spatial planning is one of the most exemplary ones in the whole world and could be used really as an economic solution, which we'll discuss in a few slides. Can you change the slide, Alex? Okay, this infographic, it describes in a nutshell the major effects of climate change on our coral reefs. The column on the far right describes a few simple steps we can all take to reduce our own personal carbon footprints and improve coral reef conditions. As we learned in class and during the previous presentations, anthropogenic activities like fossil fuel use, raising livestock, and deforestation expel greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which become trapped in the troposphere. So approximately 30% of that carbon dioxide is absorbed by our oceans, creating very unfavorable marine disturbances and conditions for marine life, especially for coral reefs. Starting at the bottom left, the warming of our oceans causes thermal stress on corals, causing them to release their zooxanthellae. And these zooxanthellae are microscopic algae that live in their tissues, that give them their color, and they're the coral's primary source of food. So when that symbiotic relationship between the coral and its zooxanthellae becomes stressed due to increased temperature and pollution, the algae leave the coral tissues, causing them to become white or bleached. We all know of coral bleaching, and this increases their susceptibility to disease. Increased sedimentation as well also smothers the coral, causing disease and changes in sea level. And as we all know, as the climate changes and the earth warms, we observe stronger and more frequent storm patterns, which destroy the reef structures. The effects of these precipitation changes tie into the sedimentation issue we just reviewed, because the freshwater runoff from urbanization, raising livestock, and other sediments create ideal conditions for algal blooms. And of course, those algal blooms then cause the water to get darker and reduce the light that corals need in order to live and for them to grow. Climate change also causes changes in ocean currents, which disrupts the cycle of larval dispersal and food circulation. So although corals are living, their mobility is obviously very limited. So these ocean circulations are a necessity for their feeding. And of course, we're all familiar with how the ocean's absorption of carbon dioxide lowers its pH, causing increased acidification. Next slide, please, Alex. This image demonstrates the major impacts of overfishing around our coral reef. So starting on the left, overfishing not only creates a harvest mortality because targeted species, they're not the only ones being captured. We have populations of bycatch and discards that are also being depleted from the ocean. Then moving to the middle section, a large amount of fishing gear is also being dumped into the ocean. So fishing gear makes up about 70% of all macroplastics in the ocean. And they're described as quote unquote ghost gear, which is a term used to describe all the plastic pollution left in the ocean from abandoned fishing equipment. To the right, we see how this affects bycatch, like I mentioned, and the overall collateral mortality of marine species. And of course, this causes a ripple effect, which destroys marine habitats. We also see that biological disruptions occur, causing a change in predator-prey interactions, like what Bunny said, which also cause changes and shifts in the marine food web. And as a result, you can see that all of these consequences from overfishing cause a severe decline in the mean trophic level, which increase ecosystem structure, they increase ecosystem structure vulnerability. And that leaves the corals and other marine life with shortened food chains and a significant decrease in their ability to cope with human-induced changes. Next slide, Alex. The world's need for seafood as a reliable protein source is only increasing, and fisheries must do their best to meet that increasing demand. In an attempt to quantify the number of reef fishers worldwide, in this study, researchers used the formula here on the bottom right to achieve estimates. So here are a few important facts. There are approximately 6 million reef fishers worldwide, with about 25% of being gleaners, which are women and children mainly in rural areas. Reef fisheries are targeted not only as a protein source, but also for export-oriented trades like live reef, food fish, and aquarium trades. And reef fisheries contribute an estimated $5.7 billion And these are worldwide statistics. They contribute an estimated 5.7 billion of the 50 billion net economic benefits obtained from healthy coral reef ecosystems. And in order to move in the direction of having sustainable fisheries, policies definitely need to be implemented in specific overfished coral reef habitats. Studies have shown by doing this, we can preserve approximately 14 to 20 billion in consumer surplus through the year 2100. And consumer surplus being defined as the gap between the price we pay for a product and the price we're willing to pay. So going back to our example of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in Australia, this is a prime example of a systematic step that would serve to increase conservation while maintaining the economics and supply necessary to continue feeding the world with our oceans. Next.
So materials used to see the effects of overfishing. One way scientists and researchers are able to see the effects of overfishing on like coral reef ecosystems is by analyzing food and energy data sets. So as overfishing continues, it takes a great toll on the fish species in the reef ecosystems. And not only does it affect the school size of the fish by dwindling them down significantly, it also plays a role on the fish's physical attributes. So as great amounts of fish are being removed from these ecosystems through overfishing, the reproduction rates begin to decline as well as their physical sizes. So I uploaded a picture where you could see just how much the school sizes and the physical size of the fish decrease. This affects the coral reef ecosystems because with populations decreasing, it sets a sort of ripple effect through the food chain, which leaves less prey for the predators and vice versa, depending on where the fish stand in the food chain. And with these data sets being reviewed by scientists, we're able to see a more in-depth view of how much of an impact overfishing has directly on the fish and reef ecosystems, and not just the effects that we see as humans. Next slide, please. And methods used to limit overfishing. One of the main sources for overfishing is IUU fishing, which stands for illegal, unregulated, and unprotected fishing. And an example of this would be big commercial fishermen ships who are out off a country's coast that are on the country's marine borders that are not abiding by the fishing regulations set by the specific country. So this means like taking in drastic amounts of fish that are for that company's benefit and not taking into account the effect it has on the environment. So we are able to see the effects IUU fishing has through worldwide decline in fish stocks, as well as the ocean's declining health as a whole. So because of these issues IUU fishing is causing on the environment, the Australian government created an organization called the Australian Maritime Information System, which basically this organization patrols the marine borders off of the coast of Australia by enforcing the country's fishing regulations and making sure that no illegal activity is taking place on its waters that has a negative impact on the coral reef ecosystems. So sorry, you're good. In the picture I uploaded, you could see a sort of map on where the Australian Maritime Information System, where that group patrols its waters and combats overfishing. Next slide, please.
Okay, so we have some recommendations to limit overfishing and help coral reefs. So one of them is to use sustainable methods to prevent loss of species and habitats. So that includes regulations on how many individuals of fish species that you can catch, and making sure that you're not removing too many of the older reproductive age fish so that you keep the fish stocks up. Another one would be government regulation, and this would be issue regulations on the length of fishing seasons and the maximum amount of yield, which I just mentioned. So if you decrease the length of fishing seasons, it allows more time for the fish stock to naturally replenish itself. The third recommendation is international cooperation. There are over 200 countries in the world, and a lot of these countries are connected by coastlines.
and it's important to work together with neighboring countries to ensure that you have sustainable fishing, because different areas can have effect on other areas around it. To continue, education is a large part of this. So if we teach sustainable fishing and agriculture in schools and inform the public of the abundance of overfishing worldwide, that would help to raise awareness for this issue and get more people thinking about how to solve it. Specific marine spatial planning policy could be implemented in overfished areas, and it would serve to mitigate the inevitable damage from climate change and can help to replenish depleted fisheries. So in conclusion, this is pretty simply said, coral reefs are dying at an accelerated rate thanks to human activity disrupting the oceans and the natural course of their ecosystem. Positive human involvement is the only way to combat this in order to keep coral reefs alive. And this is our bibliography.
Any questions?
Okay, great. So, yeah, have you heard of marine protected areas? Do you know what marine protected areas are?
Yeah, they're kind of like a national park, but in the ocean.
Okay, so would that be an effective way to help manage coral reefs?
It would. It wouldn't solve everything, as there are lots of fish that come up in the coral reefs as juveniles and then move out to the open oceans where they're snatched up by fisheries, possibly before they can reach sexual maturity, which would still impact the population rates overall, but it would definitely help the coral themselves from being destroyed physically.
Yeah, and concerning the marine protected areas, like Bunny said, they definitely do make a difference. And of course, there are different levels of marine protection. There are no-take areas, there are highly protected reserves, there are other, and especially, we talked about the reef off the coast of Queensland in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, but also off the coast of California. There's a system of staggered marine protected areas. And of course, you're going to have escapes in those marine protected areas. But overall, even the escapes help to increase the biomass overall and help to replenish fisheries. So it is definitely a helpful alternative.
Good, good. I'm glad you're familiar with that. I have one other question, then we'll have to move on. You talk a lot about the Great Barrier Reef, and that is a well-managed reef system, which is recognized as being an important source of revenue from tourism and providing other ecosystem benefits. But what are the current status of the Great Barrier Reef?
My internet just went out. Can you repeat that question, please?
Yeah, what's the current status of the Great Barrier Reef? Even though it's very well managed and recognized as an important ecological resource, what's been the recent impacts there?
I think I can answer this. Even though it's protected, it's still not as it fully was at one time, and there are problems with bleaching and a decrease in overall amount of coral around the Great Barrier Reef.
Yeah, in fact, the Great Barrier Reef has experienced really catastrophic decline over the past couple of years to where, like 30 to 50% of the, formerly healthy corals are now either stressed or dead. So, and that's due largely to thermal shock, bleaching, as opposed to overfishing. But that's just sort of something to indicate that even in a well-managed system, climate change can overwhelm a system and really impact coral ecosystems.
Yeah, I want to recommend the Netflix documentary made in 2017 called Chasing Coral. If you have Netflix right now, you should really go watch it. It's an hour and a half on the effects of climate change on the Great Barrier Reef itself, and it has time-lapse photography of bleaching that's never been filmed before, and it's a really serious and bleak look at what is happening to our coral reefs right now.
Yeah, that is a real eye-opening and somewhat depressing film. Thanks for that recommendation. All right, well, we'll have to move on now. So last up is the coral reefers. So the last one's up. So go ahead and get your slides loaded up and start your presentation, please.
Okay, almost got that. Where's present? Does it look good for everyone?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Ashlyn, and we are the coral reefers. Our topic is called How Microplastics Enter the Ecosystem. Next slide, please. Here's our outline. I'm going to be presenting the introduction. Samina's doing the microplastics, the transfer of the evidence and the removal of them. Spencer will be explaining the innovations in wastewater treatment. Alejandro is doing aquaculture and microplastics. Michelle is doing the effect of marine and human life of microplastics. Alex is doing the physical removal of them. And Sydney is doing the laws and regulations. Alejandro is also doing the recommendations, and Sydney is doing the conclusion. Next slide, please. So why should we care about microplastics? Basically, humans have disregarded the effects of plastics in the ocean ecosystems. Not until the 1960s was there an environmental movement, and out of this movement, important events began to occur, like the Annual Earth Day, the Clean Air Act in 1970, and the Clean Water Act in 1972. Scientists didn't realize the threat humans were.
Hello.
I don't know where she went.
Destruction of the ocean ecosystems in the end ultimately affect animals and other humans too, from our cosmetics to food, and animals, such as preventing the urge to eat. Next slide.
Okay, so for what are microplastics? Microplastics are classified according to their size. So any plastic particle that is smaller than 5 millimeters in diameter is considered a microplastic. Some microplastics are derived from larger pieces of plastic debris that end up in the ocean or are mechanically weathered into smaller pieces. Other forms of microplastics, such as these polyethylene microbeads, they already have that qualifyingly small size when they are introduced into the environment. And microbeads are commonly found in personal hygiene products. Some additional plastic particulates can be released into the air following the burning of waste and as byproducts of a lot of different industrial and manufacturing processes. And the issue with microplastics is that the particles are too small to be removed with wastewater treatment facilities. So instead, they end up flowing down into drainage basins and they end up in our global waters. Next slide, please. Okay. So for the trophic transfer, organisms can be exposed to microplastics through direct ingestion of particles in contaminated air or water. Microplastics can also act as a vector for the spread of persistent organic pollutants because the plastic particles can absorb and transport a lot of different toxic chemicals. So if we look in a single trophic level, we can see how plastic particles can bioaccumulate, meaning that they gradually are accumulated as an organism ingests them at a faster rate than they can be excreted. And now as successively higher trophic levels start to consume large quantities of contaminated organisms, the result is biomagnification, which is a higher concentration of microplastic particles that are found in organisms as we move up in a food web. So affected organisms have been found to show reduced feeding capacity and interrupted intestinal function, which can be detrimental to their energy reserves and also reproductive output. Some microplastic particles are also small enough to cross phospholipid bilayers in animals, which can interrupt cellular function. Also, another concern is that as the concentration of plastic is magnified as we go up trophic levels, so is the concentration of pollutants that are sort of passengers as they're absorbed in the plastic particles. And these pollutants are known to impact immune systems, neurological, and reproductive systems of any top marine predators, and that includes humans. Next slide.
So my name is Spencer Burkhart, and I decided to research the evidence of microplastics in wastewater. So that's going to include anything that comes from the household wastewater supply. So that's anything that goes down your drain, anything that's basically touched by humans and goes to a wastewater treatment facility. And at a wastewater treatment facility, they use a number of technologies and processes to try and get the water healthy enough back to put into the environment, because a lot of times they dump that excess water, the treated water, back into the environment under the notion that it's safe to go back there, which to an extent it is, because they removed a lot of the biological oxygen demand, which a lot of the contaminants, they're directly toxic. But there's a problem because you have a whole nother set of toxins coming from these microplastics that can't be removed from normal wastewater treatment processes. So this is, you get small fragments from either cosmetics. A lot of cosmetic products have those small micro beads that are very small. You know, you can barely feel them in your hand. And then you also get very, very small pieces of polyester and nylon that come from your clothing from the wear and tear of being washed thousands and thousands of times. So that makes its way into the wastewater and can sometimes be removed based on what type of treatment you're using. But they were able to determine that there was really, really small plastics making their way because of something called FTIR spectroscopy, which is infrared spectroscopy, which uses light to be able to determine what exactly is in that sample. Next slide, please. So a large portion of the larger pieces can be removed fairly easily. Those pieces that are 4 millimeters, 5 millimeters, those are still fairly large. So you can remove those in preliminary treatments. So you get skimming on the top, those less dense pieces float up to the top, and you can skim that off with grease and oil and other things like that. And the larger pieces are removed, which isn't necessarily the biggest problem that you see. And then a large majority of them the more dense particles, still those larger pieces, maybe 3 millimeters, 2 millimeters, they can be captured in what treatment facilities called flocks, which are, once you treat the water with alum or ferric, those flocks become bigger clumps of sediment and other particles that can become more dense and float into the sedimentation tank, as you can see from the graphic. And then lastly, you get tertiary removal, which is going to be a combination of biological processes with activated sludge and a filtration system, kind of like reverse osmosis, but it's combined with that. And again, you can see larger particles get removed, but also some of these biological processes and chemical processes they're using don't address the problem of microplastics. So you're seeing the very, very small particles, less than a millimeter in diameter, still going out undetected, because what wastewater treatments use as a measure for determining if it's ready to go back to the environment is a biological oxygen demand. And microplastics don't have an effect on biological oxygen demand. So this is a problem. Next slide, please. So we have to come up with some sort of innovation that lets us get these very, very small particles out, because as we saw before in the earlier slides, because of trophic transfer, there's evidence of zooplankton having, very, very small particles being ingested by them. So we know that, things that can't be seen with the naked eye are making it out into our environment. So there's not a proven method for what to do for these microplastics, because in wastewater treatment, they don't have any process that gets rid of those microscopic particles that you can't see with the naked eye. So what I researched was some methods that people are doing to see if they can remove those. And the best thing that I came up with was a compound that's like silica based, that it makes a bond with those microplastics. It makes a covalent bond with those microplastics so that it can selectively trap the microplastics. And what happens is the microplastics bond to the silica gel, and the gel starts to expand. And then it can be removed out of the wastewater, because all the microplastics get stuck with this silica gel. And then these larger silica gels caps become, about the size of a golf ball maybe in the treatment, and which obviously can be removed fairly easily from a wastewater treatment facility. And they can also be reused. So it's a sustainable way to do it, because they have the covalent bonds they make the covalent bonds with the microplastics. And then once you remove the silica gels, you can break those bonds again and then reuse them. So that's where we're at in wastewater treatment. Next slide.
So my slide is on microplastics in aquaculture. Small crustaceans have been found to burrow into the floats on docks and aquaculture farms, dispersing thousands of microplastic particles. This can be combated with the development of floats from new materials which discourage burrowing. The degradation of aquaculture structures such as nets, docks, and pens can introduce microplastics into the environment. Many species raised in aquaculture ingest microplastics because of their environment. Much of the plastic is in the form of fibers from nets. Microplastics are transferred when wild-caught species with microplastic contamination are ground into fish meal and then used in aquaculture feeding operations. Next slide, please.
All right, my name is Michelle Miggins, and I'll be talking about how microplastics affect marine life. So as we know, plastics are the most prevalent form of marine pollution. Over time, as they break down, they turn into these microplastics. These microplastics endanger all marine life, from fish to top predators. Pollutants at sea are almost as diverse as the species are endangered. Researchers have discovered that microplastics pose a threat to marine animals even when they do not directly ingest them. According to a Woods Hole Oceanographic, a 2015 study estimated that roughly 8 million tons of plastic enter the world's oceans each year, yet only 1% is found floating at the surface in visible form. Ocean currents and waves can pass the plastic across the world and affect all marine life globally. Fish can consume the microplastic, mistaking it for food, and will be highly affected as a result. Next slide. So how exactly are the microplastics passed from animals to human? Through a process known as trophic transfer, through the base of the food chain, which starts with marine organisms, including plankton, fish larvae, and filter-feeding animals such as scallops and oysters. These plastics contain toxic chemicals from the manufacturing process that are ingested by marine life, and then later consumed by humans when we eat the animals. Researchers have connected the transfer between creatures in the food chain and how fish assimilate a dangerous type of mercury called methylmercury. One study found that methylmercury builds up in aquatic food chains in such a way that top predators become highly enriched too. The more mercury the fish contain, the more dangerous it becomes for humans to consume. As it accumulates in the body, methylmercury becomes poisonous. Next slide. All right, so how do microplastics harm marine life and human life? When animals are swimming in the ocean, they can mistake the microplastics for food. When the microplastic enters the body, their digestive tract becomes blocked and their stomachs can become full of plastic. causing the fish to starve. When the animal's stomach is full of plastic, it causes starvation and leads to some animals dying due to the plastics taking over their body. Through water filtration systems, plastics all find their way from the ocean to your home. For humans, we can find microbeads in body washes, toothpaste, and other hygienic products consumed by humans that can potentially cause harm to the body. There are particles of microplastic also found in tap water and seafood, obviously, that humans eat. When humans consume the microplastics through water or food, the plastic could release toxic substances causing oxidative stress or even cancer, according to researchers. Particles small enough could be taken up by cells in the lungs and gut, while larger ones might be absorbed in the digestive tract. Next slide.
Many innovations have been made in the physical removal of microplastics from the ocean in recent years. One of these is from the company The Ocean Cleanup, and I know that a few other groups have already talked about the Ocean Cleanup in their presentations, so I won't dwell on this one too much. But specifically, the system 001B, which was nicknamed Wilson, was able to pick up plastic as small as 1 millimeter long. And what this system basically is it's a 3-meter long skirt that's in the water attached to a floater that sits on the surface of the water and collects plastic as it's pushed through the ocean. And this U shape utilizes winds and ocean currents and waves to push it towards the location where the highest concentration of plastic is, because the same forces that are congregating plastic in the ocean in those areas is what's moving moving Wilson through the water. It has many sensors and GPSs, and it sends signals when it becomes full so that a truck or a boat can come and clear the plastic from the system. So it's basically like a garbage truck in the ocean. And this system had a few hiccups, but the Ocean Cleanup has been improving their designs and is constantly innovating their processes. And a second innovation that's happened recently comes from an 18-year-old kid from Ireland named Fionn Ferreira. And he actually won the 2019 Google Science Fair for this innovation. And basically what this is he uses oil and magnetite to remove microplastic from water. So plastic is nonpolar, same with oil. So from chemistry, we know that nonpolar things like to stick to other nonpolar things. So what you do is if you have a body of water with microplastic mixed in, you can add a layer of oil to it and then stir up the mixture so that all of the oil or all of the plastic will be suspended in the oil. And then from there, you can add magnetite to it to form a ferrofluid. And you can take a magnet, dip it in the oil, and it'll remove all of the oil and plastic from the water. And this method has an 86% overall extraction rate, but it usually works on plastics that are less dense. And he recommends using lighter oils. Fionn is currently in the process of taking this removal method and upscaling it so that it can be used to remove microplastics from the ocean. But he has mentioned possibly creating a wastewater treatment method that would run water through a layer of oil, which could then have magnetite added to it and removed in a later stage, or possibly adding this method to boats so that they could passively remove microplastics through the ocean as they pass through. Next slide.
Laws and regulations for this. The Microbead Free Waters Act of 2015 was a bill that amended the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to ban rinse-off cosmetics that contain intentionally added plastic microbeads beginning on January 1st, 2018, and to ban manufacturing of these cosmetics beginning on July 1st, 2017. These bans are delayed by 1 year for cosmetics that are over-the-counter drugs. And the California Safe Water Drinking Act, microplastics, mandates that in 2021, California will adopt a standard method to test for microplastics in water and create requirements for 4 years of testing. these don't really help prevent microplastics, but they show that there's awareness that microplastics is a problem in water. And some bans that have been instituted that help prevent microplastics from entering the ocean is in Seattle, Washington. In 2018 became the first city in America to ban plastic utensils and straws in bars and restaurants. San Diego, California banned styrofoam food and drink containers in 2019. Washington, D.C. Banned plastic straws on January 1st, 2019. And the European Union voted to ban single-use plastics in 2019, and the ban is expected to come into effect as early as 2021. And the country of Peru has restricted single-use plastics in natural and cultural protected areas. These bans help reduce the amount of macroplastics that enter the ocean and will eventually break down into microplastics. As mentioned in the other plastic presentation, Florida does not have any statewide single-use plastic bans, and Florida actually has laws that make it very difficult to ban plastics. As mentioned before, Coral Gables tried to ban single-use plastic in 2016 and then styrofoam in 2017, and was then sued by the Florida Retail Federation and lost. And because of this, several small Floridian cities have passed plastic bans only to repeal them to avoid costly lawsuits.
Okay.
You need to wrap up pretty soon. Go ahead.
All right, I'll wrap up the recommendations here. Researchers do not know just how damaging microplastics can be on the environment yet. This is a relatively new problem that humans have just created in the last 100 years. We need a better understanding of how microplastics impact organisms in the short term and long term. More work must be done to create and design other innovative methods for removing microplastics from the ocean. Education and raising awareness is our best tool in the battle to remove microplastics from the ocean. The more people that are aware of just how big of a problem it is, the higher chance we have of increasing regulations on single-use plastics. Hopefully, with more education, people can better make decisions when voting on legislation that deals with plastics. Next slide.
Sorry, this slide is our conclusions. Microplastics are extremely pervasive in every region, depth, and trophic level. They've been found to negatively affect humans and animals that ingest and encounter them. In larger forms, plastic can drown marine organisms, and not all of the health impacts are fully understood. Microplastics are everywhere in human life, and we don't really realize it, and they're very difficult to remove from the ocean. But there are large-scale efforts to remove plastics and microplastics from the ocean. And here's our bibliography.
Okay, great. Well, we'll have to wrap it up here. If there's any quick questions from the audience. Okay, great. All right, listen, so the final take-home will be available tonight at midnight, I hope, unless we have any issues with Canvas, in which case it may be delayed a little bit. But we'll get it available to you very quickly. And it is due by midnight on Tuesday, a week from next week, Tuesday. And that would have been our regularly scheduled final day. If you've already the teams have all made their presentations and should now submit their abstracts and slide sets for grading. And please do that as soon as possible so we can get the grades wrapped up and everybody will know what's going on. I guess this is my chance to say that I've enjoyed this class. I think you've been a great bunch of students, very interactive and interested in this topic. I'm so sorry that we had to, change the way we were doing the class so radically. But hopefully you'll all retain something from oceanography and consider further studies in this area. And I wish you all the best in the rest of your career at FSU. And please don't forget to fill out the evaluation form for myself and for Carrie. Okay, well, you can always email if you have questions about anything on the final exam or submitting these grades. And if not, I'll end the meeting here and ask you to all go on and be safe, and we'll hopefully see you in the fall again. All right. Goodbye now.
Thank you.